Hear me okay? I'm assuming that's a yes. Okay, so good afternoon. It is 1:03 p.m. on March 18th, 2026, and we're here to talk about the wetland mapping updates. The meeting is now being recorded and will be available. There are 3 people here today in person, and the number of people on the Teams meeting is about 9 people so far. My name is Tina Heath. I'm the District Wetland Ecologist for Chittenden County within the Vermont DEC Wetlands Program. And I'm here to present upon the wetland mapping updates. This has been a really big effort over the last 7 years, so I'm happy to present what we've done with it. Along with me today is Lauren Sofer. She's the District Wetland Ecologist for Caledonia and Essex counties. And so how this is going to go today is that I will be providing an informational presentation to start, and Lauren will be handling logistics. So she'll be sending some links through the Teams chat, as well as monitoring the chat for comments and questions. And so if there are any clarifying questions that are related directly to the presentation, or you need a little bit more direction or have a question about a slide in particular, we're happy to answer those questions on the fly. So you can enter them into the chat or raise your hand. But more in-depth questions or comments we'll save for the end after the presentation. Ideally, people who are here in person today, we do recommend that you write your comments down, just so that we have an accurate recording of what you'd like to share. But you're also more than welcome to share your question or comment verbally. All comments here at the meeting, in the chat, as well as through the public comment period, will be collected, and we will produce a responsiveness summary addressing those comments. So some virtual housekeeping items. Everybody on the Teams meeting is currently on mute, and we ask that you keep your video turned off to save bandwidth. But if you'd like to speak, you can use the microphone button. You can unmute yourself. You can write your question or comment in the chat, or you can raise your hand to speak. So the presentation today will go over which wetland mapping layer is being updated, where in Vermont is this occurring and in what particular watersheds, why are we editing these maps, how to review the draft maps, and then at the end of the presentation, we'll open up the meeting to address public comments and questions. So we have 3 wetland mapping layers, and this slide provides an overview of these layers. You'll notice that there are 3 different images on the screen as well. We have images of downtown Middlebury, all in pretty much the same location, but we're looking at these images through the different lenses of the mapping layers. So we have the National Wetland Inventory layer, known as the NWI. This is available in almost every state. It is managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. NWI mapping has been completed in Vermont for a few decades now, and we have gone over several updates and iterations to that mapping over that time span. The NWI mapping, this layer, also includes mapped lakes and rivers as well. So you will see mapped lacustrine and riverine systems. Again, this is a standardized map for wetlands that spans the country. And so there are specific standards the mapping has to adhere to that is then approved by U.S. Fish and Wildlife. So this particular layer that is up for notice has already been approved by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and is already available on their map. So this is on the NWI layer today. The next layer is the Vermont Significant Wetlands Inventory layer. This is known as the VSWI. This is managed by the Vermont DEC. This was actually an adoption of the NWI when this was first created. And this is where we see wetlands that are regulated by the state of Vermont through the Vermont Wetland Rules. When the rules first came into place in 1990, only mapped wetlands and those areas contiguous to mapped wetlands were protected. However, the Vermont Wetland Rules protects wetlands significant in function and value. So it was recognized over time that the mapping cannot account for all significant wetlands on the Vermont landscape. So there was a significant rule change that occurred back in 2010 to then include unmapped significant wetlands, which were presumed to be class 2 based upon specific criteria. So wetlands that are half acre or more in size, adjacent to waterways, unique wetlands like bogs, fens, vernal pools, etc. Today, now they're known as categorical class 2 wetlands, and they are class 2 and thus protected under the rules. And then lastly, we have the wetland advisory layer. This is an informal layer managed by the Vermont DEC. This includes wetland information that has been collected by staff through various site visits and assessments, or through aerial interpretation, delineations associated with permits. This particular layer does not hold a regulatory status compared to the VSWI, but it is updated fairly continuously. So the layer that we're talking about today that is proposed to be updated is the VSWI layer. The improvements are being made to update the jurisdictional wetland mapping associated with this layer. So again, the NWI has already been updated, but we have to go through a formal approval process with the VSWI. So that includes the statewide noticing, the public meeting that we're having today, and then there's another one next Monday in White River Junction, and then the public comment period. So we have to go through that process before we can officially adopt those updates. And then again, just referring back to the images on the screen. So we have the VSWI, the NWI, and the advisory mapping imagery up of Middlebury and those similar locations. And you'll see on the VSWI image that we don't have any class 2 wetland polygons, but the updated NWI shows the updated polygons in the dark green. And then our advisory wetland mapping image also shows wetlands. So again, just showing the need to keep these maps updated. So there are many uses for these wetland mapping layers. They are helpful for landowners who are thinking about developing and wanting to get an idea of where wetlands may be located on their property. They're useful for preliminary site assessments and identifying potential regulated areas. These wetland maps are all derived from aerial interpretation at a zoomed out scale, so we're not able to see everything. The only way we can actually determine wetland boundary and extent is with an on-the-ground site assessment, where we're able to look at the soils, vegetation, and hydrology. But we still get a general idea of wetland distribution on the local landscape, and this is a great planning resource. So I want to be clear that although we can see a lot more with these updates, the map is still unable to determine absence of wetlands on a parcel and unable to determine if you need a permit or not. This still has to be concluded by visiting the property. So either setting up site visits with district wetland ecologists like myself or Lauren to be able to identify wetlands on the property, and then getting a delineation done where you're determining wetland boundaries from upland, understanding the extent of the wetland. And then if you have a project proposed, we'll be able to determine if you're going to impact the wetland or be within 50 feet of the wetlands, which is the regulated buffer zone under the rules, to determine, again, if you need a permit or not. So, the NWI mapping, which is the VSWI wetland mapping updates, this is all occurring at a zoomed out scale where it does find wetland. There is wetland in that general area, but it is important to note that it can still miss forested wetlands, small, narrow wetland fingers, and farmed wetlands, just because they're difficult to see. So the VSWI mapping updates have been occurring over the last several years with the goal of being statewide updated mapping. It first started in the Missisquoi River Basin, and this was updated and completed in early 2023. We then moved on to the Winooski, Otter Creek, Little Otter, Lewis Creek, and Pike River, which was completed in 2025. And what's up for notice through this period and what we're talking about today are the Connecticut River basins and the Northern Lake Champlain Direct. So as you can see, this is a very large area of Vermont. This is about 45% of the area. The Connecticut River Basin covers about the entire eastern half of the state. And then Northern Lake Champlain Direct is up in the northwestern corner. This work was completed by an outside contractor. This was done through the Geospatial Services at St. Mary's University in Minnesota. They're very well known for NWI mapping and adhering to their mapping standards, and they've done work in just about every state. The remainder of the state, which is about 20%, should be completed before 2027. So here we have a zoomed in image of both basins. So the Northern Lake Champlain Direct on the left-hand side and the Connecticut River Basin on the right-hand side. So, you know, we have, in terms of the Northern Lake Champlain Direct, towns that are involved are as far north as Alburgh, ranging down to the southern ends of Charlotte and Heinsberg. So these are all towns that directly drain into Lake Champlain are involved in this wetland mapping update. And then on the eastern half of Vermont in the Connecticut River Basin, we have a large swath of towns involved. So up to the furthest northern reaches of Canaan, Vermont, down to Guilford and Reedsboro on the southern ends of the state. And I'm just going to zoom in a little bit more. This is the northern half of the Connecticut River Basin and the towns involved, if you're able to kind of just pick up if you're interested to know what particular towns. And then this is the southern half. So again, a lot of towns involved, but what you'll notice is that some towns may only have a part of their town being involved in the update. And this is because the mapping updates are related to the basins that they are draining into. So the major river basins, including, like I said, the Connecticut River Basin and then Lake Champlain itself. So the towns that have watersheds draining into those basins are a part of this update. And the way that they're segregated out is that if there's a watershed break in a town, then you know, that's what will not be included. So it's not based on political boundaries or town boundaries, but watershed breaks. So why should we update the wetland maps? Well, they are a frequently used tool for project and regulatory planning. And the technology has come a long way since the 1970s, since basically when this process started. There's a photo here up on the upper left-hand part of the screen that actually shows a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service staff person drawing wetland maps. That is what used to happen, and then they were later digitized. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see basically parts of Vermont and when the wetland maps were derived, what imagery years. So the eastern half of Vermont has some seriously outdated wetland mapping. This is vintage. So this was back in the 1970s when the maps were first created for the eastern half of Vermont, where the northwestern Vermont is a little bit more recent with the 2000s. But as you can see, there's a lot of outdated mapping before these updates had occurred. So we now have better technology. We're able to really get a very clear and good idea or indication of where wetlands are on the landscape through the resources that we have available today. We're able to access digital elevational data, LiDAR. We have aerial imagery that goes through a span of years. We have leaf on, leaf off aerial imagery, et cetera. So we can really start to see some fine details that we weren't able to see prior. Okay, so the update covers a variety of improvements. So we're working on making basic corrections. As an example, you know, wetland polygons that are not in the correct places, such as being on top of a house that should be on top of a cattail wetland. Those types of corrections are being made. We're working to refine boundaries of existing wetland polygons, just because we can see those improved details. There are areas that couldn't be detected previously. And so thinking of like highly pixelated imagery from the 70s and 80s, or just heavily forested areas, it was just difficult to really be able to define wetlands from uplands. But now we have much better imagery. And also some subtractions are happening with this exercise as well. So removing wetland mapping in areas, because again, we have the technology to be able to have more confidence that wetland may not be there. I do want to note, and this is really the highlight of my message that I want to get across to everyone listening and for everybody to understand, is that the purpose of these wetland mapping updates is that we're not creating newly mapped areas. So we're not creating more wetland and more regulated wetland. These wetlands have always been there and they have been jurisdictional for decades now. So the wetland polygons that are being added as new maps, they are adhering to class 2 criteria. So again, if they're a half acre or more in size, adjacent to waterways, we're just basically applying that class 2 criteria to the maps so that people are much more aware if they have a jurisdictional wetland on their property. So just want to make sure that everybody understands we're not trying to create additional jurisdiction. We're just trying to create more transparency, clarity, and allowing people to better prepare themselves if they have a project or to avoid violations. Okay, I'm going to switch gears now, and I want to go over this fun little mapper tool that we have. This is a way for the public to view the proposed wetland map updates. So Lauren will provide a link in the chat to this mapper tool. And when you click on that link, this screen will pop up, which shows the highlighted basins up for review. So the Connecticut River Basin of Northern Lake Champlain Direct. And on the left-hand side of the web page, you'll have an address box that you can plug in your address or location of interest. You click that, this will zoom you into the area of interest. This example on the screen is downtown Brattleboro. You can toggle between the satellite aerial imagery and the topo imagery, but what you're able to see now is basically compare the old mapping versus the new improved proposed mapping. So to clarify here, the current or old mapping, the polygons are outlined in black, whereas the new proposed improved mapping are the teal polygons. So in the center portion of the screen on the lower portion here, you'll see an existing class 2 wetland highlighted in black. But you'll see that with the improved mapping, modifications have occurred to that polygon. Whereas in the upper portion of the screen, we have some wetland polygons that were added. And in particular, I'm going to zoom in again to this polygon highlighted in the red circle. So you click on this polygon, and what will happen is that an attribute table will pop up, which gives you informational or provides information about the wetland. You'll understand the wetland type it is based on the various coding, the size estimate and acreage, who mapped this, whether it's approved or not, etc. What's important to note with this attribute table is that this is where you can report and submit a comment that is specific to the polygon or to this area. So this is where it's a great opportunity to provide that location-specific comment if you have one. So you click on that report comment tab and a comment box will pop up, and you're just plugging in your email address and then submitting your comment. Again, just to take a step back quickly, there are generally 3 ways to submit your comments during this period. You can do this through that comment box associated with the mapper tool. You can provide written comments to the environmental notice bulletin. And you can obviously provide comments today at this public meeting, either verbally, written down, or in the chat. But what we're really looking for with this particular comment box associated with the polygons is useful site-specific comments. So again, the mapping updates are trying to improve the jurisdictional mapping. So the polygons that we see on this map are Class 2 regulated wetlands. And if you have information and evidence to support that that particular wetland polygon is not Class 2, we would like to know. So for example, if this polygon is overlaid on a manure pit or another similar feature built in uplands, but not regulated by the state rules, then we want to know about that. We worked pretty hard to omit those types of features in this update, but obviously that can still occur. So again, site-specific information is most helpful when plugging in with this tool. Okay. And before I conclude the presentation, I wanted to provide some interesting numbers associated with the updated wetland mapping. So focusing again on Northern Lake Champlain, direct, 3 counties and a total of 25 towns were involved in the update. As I said, outside contractors, St. Mary's University were the ones to actually produce the wetland maps, but we had specialists within our program go out to various field locations to be able to verify that the mapping was correct or not. So 138 locations were assessed in the field, and we basically seen a net increase of 11% in identified wetland area. So this takes into account subtractions and additions. So certain towns had added wetland mapping acreage and others lost some wetland mapping acreage, but overall there was an 11% increase. To provide an example and some context, the town of Alberg had 23% less wetland acreage mapped, which was a decrease in over 1,500 acres, whereas South Hero had an increase of about 10%, which equates to about 120 acres. So again, interesting to see the subtractions and additions with having much better technology to use. We also wanted to see if there was overlap with other mapped natural resource areas. So we looked at river corridors and wetland natural communities. River corridors are these mapped areas where streams and rivers should be moving due to their hydrological dynamics. And we found that in this basin, 58% of all river corridors were also in mapped wetland areas. And then in terms of the wetland natural communities, so these are specific vegetation communities that are deemed state significant because they are high in quality and or rare. And there was a 59% overlap with the mapped wetland area. So just really interesting to see the overlap and then being able to identify areas of significant wetland function and value on the landscape. So this exercise was also applied to the Connecticut River Basin. Again, this is a huge swath of area in Vermont. So 10 counties and over 125 towns involved. 635 locations were assessed in the field. There was a 117% increase in identified wetland area. A little bit more context to this, Woodstock had a 144% increase in wetland area detected, which was an increase in 384 acres. Whereas in Westminster, there was a 96% decrease in wetland area, which approximated to about 1,500 acres of wetland. So just really interesting, again, to see how these updates have resulted in. 43% of all river corridors are in mapped wetland area, and 12% of those significant natural communities that are mapped are also in the mapped wetland areas. So this concludes the informational presentation. Again, written comments will be accepted on the environmental notice bulletin through March 31st, 2026. That is the end of our public comment period for these particular updates. I'm now going to open up the meeting to have people provide their questions and comments. I think maybe the best way to do this is if we start with questions or comments from people today here that are present at the meeting, and then we can move to the virtual chat and go over any written comments or questions. And then obviously, if people want to raise their hand and speak out loud in the virtual meeting, we can do that as well. Yes, and then just please state your name and yes, and then you can provide your comment or question.
I have a question, actually. My name is Steve Como. I'm from South Burlington. And so I was looking at the map today, the new map online, and there's an area in South Burlington which is called the Great Swamp.
Yes.
Which is kind of been well known for quite a long.
That kind of runs parallel to Spear Street, correct? Or in that
Yeah,
area?
between Dorset.
Yeah,
and Houston.
yeah.
And on this map, it has like the black line around it, but there's no green around, now the new green. So I was just trying to get clarification. If there's no green or the light green color
Yes,
in
within,
the Great Swamp, then does that mean that it's not considered wetland anymore? 'Cause this is the marsh over here.
yeah,
And over here is the Great Swamp, which is more wooded.
right,
It's pretty wet in there.
yeah.
Typically. So does that indicate that is like what used to be considered wetland, but isn't anymore?
Well, I think so. To backtrack a bit to the presentation and to clarify how the wetland key works with those maps is that those polygons outlined in black is essentially the current or old version of the VSWI mapping layer. So that's sort of what was there. And now the teal areas that you're talking about are associated with the updated wetland maps that were provided to us from St. Mary's University. So we're going to see modifications like that to existing polygons. We're seeing that and with all of these updates. That being said, they're able with, again, the improved technology, being able to refine those wetland boundaries. But again, just to reiterate, true wetland boundary and extent is determined on the ground. So that just because the wetland polygon was modified due to the updates still doesn't mean that reflects the true wetland boundary or extent of it. We would still have to go there and get a delineation done to determine the wetland boundary and the extent. So the teal areas, again, are just helping to refine those boundaries with improved technology, but wetland may still exist beyond those teal areas. We really just need that ground assessment to be able to determine, again, the real boundary, if that makes sense.
So if it is in the black polygon, without an overlay, the new teals, then it's and if you were to go over there and say, hey, this is really wet, it still is wet.
Yes.
Is that when you put a comment in for that polygon?
Yes. Yeah.
Say, hey, this is really still wet.
Yes.
I mean,
So,
especially something like that.
Right.
Significant, I'm talking about something significant here,
yeah.
which is called the Great Swamp. It was just kind of.
Yes, I'm familiar with that wetland complex. So yeah, so the wetland mapping updates had, with St. Mary's being the contractor, they had to adhere to those NWI standards, which are pretty specific, that has to be approved with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. However, so we have, those are basically our polygons that are being presented on the VSWI layer. That being said, the VSWI layer can also be updated to reflect actual conditions through delineation. So we can kind of expand beyond the NWI at times to be able to reflect what's actually out there. And again, just because the map shows a wetland boundary still doesn't necessarily mean that that's what we would use to absolutely determine where the wetland is. It could still very much extend beyond those new updated areas.
Thanks.
Yeah, but I would encourage you, again, yeah, if you want to use that mapper tool and just submit that question, we can, again, address that from a responsiveness summary to you so that you have some more context.
My name's Rachel Tobler. On your slide there, you have March 31st, 2026 for comment, and then in this notice, you have April 3rd.
Oh, that's a good distinction to figure out. I'm going to have to clarify that for you guys. I'll talk to my manager, Laura LaPierre, who is the most informed with this process, but we'll get that clarified. And we'll let people know about that. Thank you for pointing that out, though.
Yeah, no problem. I think that's the only time I saw that difference in dates, so.
Yes.
Hi, Shane Geiger, Shelburne Stormwater Superintendent. I'm noticing a couple areas where stormwater treatment practices are covered by the new teal layer. Would it be best to go through for each one of those, making a comment? Because I would imagine, I guess that's a good question too, is for constructed ponds and infrastructure like that, should it be coming up on this layer?
So the wetland rules, the Vermont wetland rules do not regulate constructed features that have wetland characteristics but are wholly built in upland. We are not regulating those features.
Okay.
There are times where those are mapped as wetland features, but should be taken off the map. If these stormwater features are adjacent or a part of wetlands, and we will see at times stormwater features being, years ago were built in wetlands because it's the lowest part of the landscape, then there could still have some jurisdictional overlap. But I would say for you, I think what would be most helpful for everybody is to use that mapper tool, submit your comments on those particular features. And then if you want to add additional context, you can submit a written comment to the ENB. And if you have further evidence or information to support that those features should not be identified as wetlands with these updates, and we would like to see that.
Okay. Yeah, I can do that. Because I see there's some that make sense that they're like adjacent,
Yeah.
but then there's one that's like a pretty recent treatment
Okay.
practice, and it's interesting, it's only half of it is highlighted, but.
Yeah, okay, good to know. Yeah, again, these updates are big improvements, but they don't cover everything. Not all wetlands are mapped on that. They won't ever all be mapped. And modifications still need to occur when it comes to real boundary and extent on the ground. Okay. If everybody's good with questions here in the room, happy to open it up in the virtual Teams meeting.
I only have. Okay, so Caroline Foley, just noting that you had the same question related to South Burlington, so we covered that. And then from Dean Pierce, Katina walked through the rationale for her comment indicating that no new wetlands would be regulated as a result of updated maps. I think her remark was that they were regulated before, even though not mapped. I'm most interested in understanding that statement as it would apply to a newly mapped wetland that is nowhere near any other wetland, water body, or water course.
Yes, no, it's a good question and another one, a good question to go through again so that I can try to best explain it to my abilities here. So new wetland polygons that may pop up due to these updates are basically just showing wetlands that have been there and have been there for a long time. And the wetland polygons that do pop up, if they are mapped, they are adhering to the class 2 criteria that would make them jurisdictional. So to backtrack a little bit, the Vermont Wetland Rules protects mapped class 2 wetlands, wetlands that are contiguous to those mapped wetlands, and then unmapped significant wetlands based on certain criteria such as size, adjacency to waterways, etc. So with the improved wetland mapping updates, we're basically just trying to provide clarity and picking up more of these wetlands that are jurisdictional regardless of whether they were mapped before or not. So again, not trying to create jurisdiction in new areas, but reiterating and providing clarity to landowners, property owners that, you know, with the improved technology that we have, we're better able to pick that wetland up. It is now identified on the maps and should be easier for someone to understand its jurisdiction. So going back to the basics, we're not trying to add wetlands. We're not creating wetlands. We're not trying to create new jurisdictional areas. They've always been jurisdictional, but these maps are visually providing where these wetlands are located due to the improved technologies that we have to be able to see them remotely. And you had a couple parts to that question. Let's see.
Maybe this piece.
Yeah, so the Vermont Wetland Rules protect wetlands that are either a half acre or more in size, which is pretty consistent with the NWI mapping in terms of size. However, our rules, when it comes to wetlands being adjacent to waterways, can consider wetlands smaller than that as being jurisdictional. There is actually specific language in the rules that state that wetlands only have to be 2,500 feet in size and adjacent to a waterway to be jurisdictional. So that is why you may see pretty small wetland polygons be picked up because, and not associated with like larger complexes or adjacent to larger complexes. It's because it's, again, adhering to class 2 criteria that we use that is based and stated in our rules. So I hope that helps to answer some of your questions there, Dean. Again, we'll be concluding and wrapping this all up into a written responsiveness summary, but that's a good question.
Okay, and we got a thumbs up from Dean. Tyler Marshall, would other infrastructure like sewer lines be regulated in the same way as stormwater infrastructure?
Yes, I think regardless of the wetland maps, if we have a structure within jurisdictional class 2 wetland, that structure and activities that involve that structure, whether it's replacement, reconstruction, rerouting, etc., would be regulated in the same way. So determining if the activity could qualify as an allowed use or if it would need a permit. So that would be within mapped wetlands and also unmapped significant jurisdictional wetlands.
Okay, and then I'll read the next one in the chat. And Amy, I did see your hand raised, so I'll read that after Kate Kelly's comment. So from Kate Kelly, it seems that there is a way to click on a green polygon on the map and make a note that it is not a wetland or that the wetland extends more in one direction, but no way to mark a spot not showing up on the map that likely is a wetland. Is this true? If so, how do you recommend calling out these points, or is it not worth doing?
No, I think it is important to note that type of comment can be submitted through the Enviro Notice Bulletin. And I think you can provide attachments. So if you had an image of that area for us to take a look at, if you can't provide an attachment, then you can certainly email us and we can address that and take a look. But yes, I think comments related to where there may or may not be class 2 wetland would be good to get from the public.
Okay, and then Amy, I know your hand was raised.
Oh, hi, can you hear me?
Yes, hi, Amy.
Okay, hi Tina, how are you?
Good.
So I'm looking at the map. I'm looking at like the Colchester Bog areas specifically. And so it shows like the large overall proposed wetland. And then when you go to click on a part of that wetland, it just isolates the what I think is it's organized by like cover type. Like NWI wetlands are. And so then the rest of the wetland disappears. So when I initially went to look at it, I was like, oh my God, that is drastically smaller. But it was because the rest of the wetland different cover types just disappeared when you isolate and search for one specific polygon. So I don't know if the mapping can be updated so that you can like select something and have it highlighted, but it doesn't make all of the contiguous wetland areas disappear. Because I submitted a comment and then I was like, oh wait, I guess that wasn't right because I didn't realize the rest of the wetland disappeared.
So Amy, are you saying that if you click on a large wetland complex like the Colchester Bog, it's only highlighting areas of the wetland that are under the same cover type and then everything else disappears?
Yeah, just that specific area that you selected. So like right now it's selecting like, yeah, the PFO/SS NWI code. And then when I go to clear search location, everything shows up again. Like the larger, complex. But that could be confusing for people who maybe aren't aware of what's happening, or it's not really described in the that text on the left side of the mapper.
Amy, you pointed out a flaw or a challenge well in that you need, so say you're searching for a specific address to get to the area. You then need to X out, as you said, clear that address and the polygons will appear. You will then be able to comment because the polygons will appear. So when you first type in the address, it takes you to the location. It seems like no polygon is there until you X out of that address and then they appear. And it gives you the ability to right click and submit a comment. If I'm understanding you correctly.
Yeah, yep. Yeah, I just wasn't sure if there was a way to be able to still show everything, but only, highlight and keep the specific wetland cover type on the left side. So, I mean, it's probably an Esri mapper, right? I don't know, maybe. Yeah. So there should be a way to like keep everything showing, but then click what you want on the left side of the map. I don't know.
Yeah.
No, these are helpful comments. Again, we've heard similar comments with just aspects of polygons disappearing or just not being as presentable as assumed that they would be. So these are duly noted. We appreciate the comment.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
And I'll just reiterate Tina's point that if you have a challenge interacting with the mapper tool, please do screenshot and share via the ENB. And we can note your comment that way too. Okay, I don't have any other comments in the chat. And I don't see any other hands raised. But we can give you a few moments here.
Yeah, if anybody would like to voice any comments or questions in the virtual Teams meeting, please do so. And yes, we'll have a couple minutes here if anybody else would like to provide thoughts or questions. All right, well, we're not hearing or seeing anything else. We will conclude the meeting. We will clarify the public comment period when it ends. That was a good note. But yes, comments, we're able to receive comments through the end of this public notice period. Again, you can submit them through the environmental notice bulletin or the mapper tool. So we encourage you to do that once you've been able to process some of the presentation a bit. And if anything else pops up, please provide comments or questions. So I guess I will officially conclude this meeting at 1:49 p.m. Thank you all for coming. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.